Hello, my name is Susannah Shattuck, and I am here to talk to you about how to build responsible AI/ML products. So, a bit about me. I'm currently head of product at Credo AI, where I spend my time building tools that help companies build responsible AI. And I've been working in the responsible AI space for a while. I've held product roles at a few different companies, IBM, Google X, and Arthur AI, before joining Credo. Now, I am deeply passionate about this space, the responsible AI space, because to be honest, after working in enterprise AI for 6 years, I've seen some pretty gnarly things happen with production AI systems. There is a lot that can go wrong, from unintended harmful bias to negative feedback loops to degrading performance over time. And really, as product managers, we have a core responsibility to make sure that our products are designed, built, and launched with our end users in mind, and that they don't cause harm. So, as more of our products begin to rely on or incorporate machine learning into their core functionality, we really need to take into consideration a lot of new dimensions of potential harm. So, this talk will, I hope, provide you with a starting point. I want to talk about how to build AI/ML products that really make the future a place that we want to live in. So, where do we actually begin? Well, in my talk description, I promised no buzzword bingo. And so far, I will confess I'm not doing a great job. I've already said responsible AI more times than I can count. But this is really actually one of the biggest problems, I think, with responsible AI today. There are so many tools and frameworks and companies that talk about helping to provide AI governance or ethical AI or AI principles. I could go on and on. But the problem is really that nobody agrees what any of these terms actually mean. And there's very little focus right now on how to take high level AI principles and really put them into practice. So, what I'd like to do with all of you today is a couple of key things that I really hope will help us cut through this noise. First, I want to define what responsible AI actually means. What are the specific features and behaviors of AI/ML products that make them responsible? And then I want to talk about how to design, build, and deploy AI/ML products that have these qualities. And I hope to leave you with some really, really tactical questions and suggestions that can start helping you define responsible AI acceptance criteria for your products. So, first things first, what is responsible AI? What are the features of a responsible AI product? Well, there are 6 key tenets of responsible AI, 6 qualities or characteristics that we need to evaluate to understand whether an AI product is responsible. Responsible AI products are fair, transparent, safe and secure, privacy preserving, socially and environmentally responsible, and finally, built and managed by accountable individuals. So I know all of that sounds nice, but let's talk about what actually this means in practice. I'll go a little bit deeper into each of these categories so we really are all on the same page here. At its most basic, a fair AI system or product is one that does not disproportionately benefit or harm one group over another. Now, what this actually means for a specific machine learning model or AI product is highly dependent on how that product is going to be used. So for some use cases, like credit risk scoring or hiring, we want to make sure that we are achieving parity of outcomes. That is, we want to make sure that one group isn't being rejected from receiving a loan or an employment offer at a much higher rate than any other group. Now, for other use cases, parity of performance rather than outcomes is really what matters. I'll give you another example. A model that analyzes CT scans and tries to predict whether or not a patient has a cancerous tumor is a great example of a system that would be harmfully biased if it performs less accurately on some groups than others, some groups of patients. even if the rates at which patients are predicted to have cancer is similar across all groups. And so fairness is really a context dependent quality, but we need to make sure that our AI systems are fair. Next, transparency. Now, transparency and explainability are often used interchangeably, but I'm very intentionally using the word transparency here because it's so much more than explainability. It's really about how easy it is for your end users to understand how your AI product works. And responsible AI products are easily understood by end users. They're highly transparent. Now, explainability is one key dimension. Can we understand exactly how the input features of our data contribute to different prediction outcomes? That is critical. But there are other dimensions of transparency that are just as critical and, quite honestly, a whole lot more basic. Things like, how good is your documentation that's available to end users? Do end users know that they're interacting with an AI system? Safety and security. So responsible AI products must be safe and secure. Safety is really all about understanding and minimizing failure modes. How bad is it when this AI system fails? And ultimately, how can we make it less bad? Things like off switches or human review and control are critical to AI safety. And then security. Now, because AI ML systems are learning systems, they're vulnerable to all kinds of new attacks. Adversarial attacks are one example that you may have heard of, where input data is manipulated in a way that isn't very meaningful or obvious to a human, but that completely changes the machine learning model's prediction. So when we're dealing with questions of security for our AI ML products, we need to test them for all kinds of new vulnerabilities. Privacy is a very well-known concern, not just for AI, but for any software system that's dealing with data. Now, machine learning models are trained on data, and when personal data is involved, privacy becomes a critical concern. And a huge part of this is evaluating your data. But as product managers, we also need to consider the privacy implications of our end products and the user interactions and experiences that they enable and require. Next, social and environmental well-being. This is a really, really important one and also a very challenging tenet to address. Now, I think we've all heard plenty of examples of AI that had unintended social or environmental consequences. Like a great example are the recommendation systems of social media networks that trap people in content bubbles. But when the primary objective of your model causes negative feedback loops more generally, that's really when you have a big problem here. So responsible AI products are ones where potential negative impacts on people and the environment have not only been considered, but have been effectively mitigated throughout the development process. Now, finally, accountability. A responsible AI development process holds people accountable for the decisions that they and the AI systems they build make. Humans are in the loop not just at the point of a model decision, but really throughout the development lifecycle. And identifying individuals who are accountable for reviewing development decisions and outcomes is essential for a responsible AI development process. So great. We have these 6 tenets. Now what? Well, there's a very famous saying, you may have heard it, what gets measured gets managed. And we live and die by this as PMs, I know, but this concept holds particularly true for those responsible AI tenets. To build responsible AI products, we need to translate each of those 6 tenets into acceptance criteria that you can measure and manage during the product development lifecycle. So now I want to transition to talking about how you actually do this, the process of defining and assessing responsible AI acceptance criteria in parallel with your normal product process. So here we have a typical product development lifecycle for a machine learning based product. How does responsible AI assessment fit in? Now, this is how most teams start doing responsible AI assessment. They basically just add one extra step to their normal process, some kind of responsible AI check-in where they're defining their responsible AI ACs and evaluating whether their product is meeting them, in really one fell swoop, one step. And it's usually right before deployment, right before launch. Now, if this is the way that you're doing things today, that's great. You're doing a check-in. That's honestly better than a lot of teams out there. But if I'm being really honest with you, this is not a great process and is likely to produce pretty mediocre outcomes. And this is why. The first problem here is that there are already all kinds of decisions that have been made and can't really be changed at this stage of the development lifecycle. You've already gone through the trouble of sourcing a training data set, building a model. You've probably spent a lot of time and resources to get to this point. So unless your responsible AI check-in unearths something truly catastrophic, then there's a very low willingness at this point to make significant changes to your product. And of course, your team is really excited to launch at this point. I mean, who can blame them for seeing the responsible AI check-in as some kind of annoying burden that slows them down? Now, I work with a lot of newly formed AI governance or responsible AI teams across Credo AI's customers, and so many of them are desperate to be seen as business enablers rather than business blockers. But I always tell them, if you structure your responsible AI oversight process like this, you're almost certainly going to be seen as a blocker. The incentives are terrible here. So I'd like to argue that responsible AI check-ins and assessment must happen throughout the product lifecycle at every single step. And we as PMs are a critical leader in guiding this process. Now, doing it like this allows you to catch issues before they're too expensive or annoying to fix. It reduces the amount of responsible AI effort at each individual step by spreading the work over a longer time scale. And in my opinion, most importantly, it transforms the culture of your team. Responsible AI check-ins won't be seen as a blocker anymore. They're instead an easy way to build more valuable and effective products. I have seen so many teams go from being reactive to proactive about responsible AI issues by just changing the way that they do responsible AI check-ins and assessment. It's truly such an awesome hack. So you might be wondering, what exactly should I be doing at each of these stages? Well, here's the set of steps that we recommend at Credo AI. Responsible AI assessment begins during discovery as you're uncovering user needs and pain points. You need to uncover and evaluate the relevant use case context that informs your responsible AI acceptance criteria. Now, as soon as you start going into the design of your system, you need to start defining the technical and process responsible AI requirements of your product, your responsible AI acceptance criteria. These are things like, answers to the questions of how you're going to define what fair is for this use case, whether or not you need local or global explanations for your model decisions, how secure your system needs to be, what kind of tests do you need to run as part of your red team exercises. These are really, really critical things to do early in the development lifecycle, because as soon as you start building and training, you need to use these responsible AI acceptance criteria to make trade-off decisions about model architecture, what data sets you'll use, et cetera. And so during training and testing, your data scientist really should be using these responsible AI technical criteria to make decisions about how to build these models. So if you're doing all of this, by the time you get to your risk and compliance review, you're already pretty confident that your AI product really meets those requirements that you laid out at the beginning. So you've eliminated the likelihood of gotchas that really send you all the way back to the drawing board. Now, of course, we all know that the work doesn't stop when you launch. And when you deploy your AI ML product in the real world, there are a couple key things that you need to do. You need to provide disclosures and documentation to your end users. That's transparency. And you must conduct regular responsible AI audits and monitor for critical responsible AI metrics in the exact same way that you monitor performance and drift. Machine learning models change over time, and you want to make sure that they're not changing in a way that makes them less responsible. So that's how you incorporate responsible AI assessment into your product development lifecycle. Simple, right? Now, I really cannot emphasize this point enough, and I'll bring it up again before I end this presentation. This is not the work of a PM, a data scientist, or any one team alone. There are going to be a ton of challenging decisions that need to be made along the way. And so you need to bring your risk and compliance teams into the mix. You need to talk to business stakeholders. And critically, you need to invite outside perspectives from end users and impacted populations. This is a really hard multidisciplinary problem to solve. And so you need to solve it with a multidisciplinary team. Okay, so this is the high level roadmap. Now let's get tactical. How do you actually go about your most important task during this process, which is defining those responsible AI acceptance criteria? So first, what are responsible AI acceptance criteria? Well, we need to define acceptance criteria for each of those 6 tenets that I mentioned. And really, you should have a measurable or observable result identified for each dimension. And some of those acceptance criteria are going to be technical features of your machine learning models. So for example, specifying a specific level of model performance for each group that interacts with your system as the acceptance criterion for ensuring that your system is fair, ensuring parity of performance. Now, other acceptance criteria are going to be particular processes that need to take place during development. For example, evaluating whether your training data set has any labeling bias, which might result in unintended harmful bias of your end product. And to define these technical and process requirements, you need to convene a multi-stakeholder team. Don't worry, this is not something that you really should do alone. So getting to those responsible AI acceptance criteria is a 3-step process. You first align on your use case context. Then you translate that context into regulatory and ethical requirements. And finally, you translate those requirements into measurable acceptance criteria. This process must be driven by multi-stakeholder collaboration. Your risk and compliance teams are going to know a lot about the regulatory requirements for your AI/ML system. Your company's internal AI ethics board might have relevant frameworks for thinking about ethics or values-based requirements. And your end users, the people from the communities who will be impacted by your product, are, again, a critical perspective to make sure is represented during this requirements definition process. Get out of the building and make sure that you hear their needs and challenges. Now, as a product manager, you have unique understanding and control over the most important thing for this process, the context. Your product context is the starting point for determining how to define how your system must be fair, how it must be transparent, how it must be safe and secure, etc. So context about your product includes information like where it's going to be deployed, who your target users are, how human in the loop or automated your product is, whether your machine learning models will be automatically retrained continuously or manually retrained frequently. We really have a critical role to play as PMs in this process by making sure that our product context is defined as clearly and comprehensively as possible to drive the right selection of requirements and ultimately ACs. So this brings me to the last part of my presentation, sharing with you all a very tactical toolkit that I hope will help you get started with the process of building responsible AI products. So I created this toolkit, a set of questions that help you define the most critical components of your product context that will help you select responsible AI requirements and ultimately responsible AI acceptance criteria. So I'm making this freely available to anyone watching this talk. I'll share a link with you all during the Q&A shortly. And it's truly my hope that this toolkit will help you develop a responsible AI assessment process to complement your existing product processes so that we all end up building AI/ML products that make the world better, not worse. So thank you so much for taking the time to come hear me talk about responsible AI. I really hope that you found it useful, and I'm very excited to hear your questions and thoughts during the Q&A. Thank you.